And why don't you quickly explain to people that may not know how to use the chat?
Okay, sure. So at the bottom of your screen is a little dialogue bubble and the word chat beneath it, and you click on it and there should be a white window that opens on the right of your screen. And when that opens, you'll see it'll say to with a colon, and then it's a blue bar and it'll say everyone, or it might say to me or to other people. And so you want it to say everyone or just my name, and you put the question there. And that way, and you just type it in and you hit return and you are good to go. So that's how we get your questions. Now, if you do it to everyone, everybody can see what you type. There are people who sometimes want to have a private question, and so then you would just send it to me. So thank you for reminding me to do that. So I do believe it was Rayanna who brought us to
Yes.
Frederick Presbyterian. So Rayanna, why don't you tell us just a little bit about how the genesis of this session, and then I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Well, I retired May 1st and I was watching MSNBC in the morning and I saw Stephen and Nolan on I think it was the 9 o'clock show with Stephanie Rule.
Yeah.
And I was, it just spoke to me. It was exactly what I have been struggling with as far as discussing politics and current events with some of my longtime friends that I was now avoiding because we couldn't have a civil conversation. So when I heard you two, I thought, I really need this. And I don't know if other people in the church would need it, but I went to one of our ministers and I started asking if it was something we could bring to Frederick Presbyterian, and it just kind of snowballed from there, and here you are.
We're glad to be here too.
Yes, thank you for reaching out, Rayanna. It was really nice and fortuitous. So I'm glad we could bring it to you guys. Lisa, would you like to introduce us and do a little welcome?
Sure. Well, welcome everyone. I'm so delighted to see everybody here. This is awesome. I guess the comfort of your own home in a snowstorm is the way to do it, right? So I'm chair of the Compassion, Peace, and Justice Committee at Frederick Presbyterian, and we have done a variety of different programs, most recently focusing on racial justice and social justice issues. And so when Rayanna came to me, or through the church got to me, to our committee, we thought it would be a good idea because we are having difficulty talking about things, both from politics to just simple issues to vaccines to all kinds of things happening now. So I'm grateful that we're here, and I'm anxious to hear from Stephen and Nolan. Mm-hmm. And I want to just, before you start, I want to say something about when I was publicizing this. I publicized it to not only the church, but also out on Facebook to some of my political friends. And I got some pushback because of the word civility. So they said Civility Project, and they were allies of the racial justice movement and allies of Black Lives Matter, and they really feel the term civility can be a negative term because we've been asking the BIPOC community to be civil for so long, and it's not really getting anywhere. And it's when they do civil disobedience that it comes in there. So I felt a little pushback on that, and I was kind of surprised at that because my of civility is maybe a little different, and I was unaware of that. So Stephen, when you talk, and Nolan as well, if you could kind of address that, I would be grateful, because I'd like to be able to, I'm doing this because I want people to be able to talk to one another. And if we're getting mired in semantics to even begin a conversation, I think that will be, that's difficult. So anyway, you don't need to hear from me. Lynn, Nolan, Stephen, thank you. Take it away.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm so glad you brought that up too. I was going to ask you to if you didn't, because I thought that was really fascinating. And it's the first time we've heard that. We've heard pushback, and there may have been some that we just didn't know, but I'm so glad to know about it. And Stephen and Nolan, I hope you guys will respond to that.
Sure.
When we get started. let's just jump into the sponsor video really quickly. I just want to share this with you guys to thank Delta Dental for their generosity in sponsoring this year. And that's how this comes to you free of charge, and you can attend free of charge. And that's how we get paid to do this. And it's been really coast to coast, despite all of the travails of this incredible year. So thank you to Delta Dental. We'll watch this and then we'll jump in.
We are living in challenging times. Politics is polarizing. Racism is rampant. The pandemic is frightening, and families are divided. Tough times require more dialogue and more understanding. But navigating our differences constructively is hard work. Delta Dental believes that healthy, smart, vibrant communities are also civil and harmonious. They are places where disagreement does not have to be toxic or destructive. Civility starts with listening. Welcome to the Civility Project.
So Stephen and Nolan, I'd like to turn it over to you. And if you'd like to start with Lisa's question, or just jump in with how the Civility Project came to be and what we're trying to do here, I'll leave it in your hands to take it where it needs to go.
Well, Lynn, I think we should start by introducing ourselves, since we're not in this market. And
Yes.
most of the time our discussions, our sessions are within this Detroit market where, folks know us. You all don't know us. And so, I am the conservative editorial page editor of the Detroit News, and been here in this role for 20 years. And when I first started interacting with Stephen, he was the liberal editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. And we are fortunate in Detroit to have two independent and fairly equal newspapers serving this market. That's very unusual these days. And so when we first came together, folks around town thought it'd be fun to put us together and watch us fight. And so we appeared on television and radio and speaking to groups with the idea of this point counterpoint. And what we found over time is, we passionately disagreed, but we also, felt a kinship, a friendship. And that surprised a lot of people who thought, what they saw on the camera, that passion and that back and forth, sometimes even anger, was, would carry over into our personal relationship. And it surprised folks. And that's how we got started talking about the Civility Project. I'll let Steve jump in.
Yeah, so before I start, I should say that Frederick is a place that's pretty close to my heart. I spent about 14 years, in fact, living in Baltimore, just down the road from you guys. I was the deputy editorial page editor at the Baltimore Sun for many years, and then worked in Washington as a journalist. Commuted back and forth, but Frederick was one of my favorite places to go, in kind of the gateway to Western Maryland is how I always thought of Frederick. So I know exactly where Frederick Presbyterian is. In fact, I could probably find it without a map. So it's really cool to be talking to you guys. As Nolan said, he and I sit on very polar opposite sides of the political spectrum. And it was our job to do that for a long time. And as he said, people really did revel in the idea of, getting us together on television or radio or on panels and watching us go at it. And we are good at that. We have genuine, deep disagreements about just about every political issue you might think of. But over time, as we started to do that, we ended up spending a lot more time together than just the arguments that we had. And because we were spending that time together, we started to learn a little more about each other. And we started to learn that, of course, both of us are more than the sum of our political outlooks. We both have very strong, passionate beliefs, and we don't back down from those. And I'll get a little more into this in a minute, but Lisa's question about that term civility, we aren't talking about getting along or sitting in a sharing circle or these kind of things that de-emphasize differences. In fact, what we're saying is that you can lean into your disagreements. You can lean into the things that you believe and why they are different from somebody else if you have a kind of safe space to do that. And that safe space is actually the relationship you have with the person you're talking to. If you're doing that with someone who you have reduced to nothing more than the sum of their politics, that doesn't work, right? It's impossible to have a meaningful exchange under those circumstances. What Nolan and I have found is that the exchanges we have don't have a limit. No topic is off limits, and no amount of feeling or passion on either of our parts is off limits, because both of us knows that as angry as we might get and as much as we might disagree, there is this relationship that sort of sits in the background that holds the whole thing intact, no matter what else happens. This is a year when I think that whole question of civility has been tested in a way that not many of us have seen before. And certainly those of us in the African American community, other marginalized communities are finally standing up and saying, look, that's it, no more of this. And we will not stop at just dialogue to make that point, right? We're going to get into the streets and we are going to confront the people who are holding us back. And there is nothing about civility that frowns on that activity. In fact, civil disobedience, the word that begins the phrase, is civil. It is the idea that we live in a country that cherishes the idea that you can stick up for your rights, you can resist oppression, and that there's nothing wrong with that. I think when we talk about civility, though, what we are kind of trying to focus on is the ability in very close-in spaces with the people who you know, the people in your neighborhood, the people in your school or your workplace, the people in your church. In your case, how can you establish a dialogue with those folks that recognizes the differences among you and does not shy away from them, doesn't shut down the dialogue because of that, or doesn't destroy the relationship because of the disagreement. These aren't mutually exclusive concepts. You can be out in the streets protesting and pushing for an end to the injustices that we've seen define this country for far too long, and you can still have a constructive relationship with somebody who sits on the other side of that equation. Civility doesn't ask you to countenance the repression of your rights. It doesn't ask you to subdue within yourself the passion that you have about those rights. It says that in order for us to make progress on that issue or any of the other issues that divide us, we've got to be able to have a dialogue. We got to be able to talk about these things, and we have to be able to get angry. We have to be able to get passionate. We have to be able to say things that make other people uncomfortable, sometimes, and you can't do that unless you have the kind of relationship with that person that makes that okay to do. Nolan and I have found that again, getting to know more about each other and understanding why each of us thinks the things that we do and where it comes from is sort of a path to this brand of civility. A few years ago, the NPR project called StoryCorps came to Detroit, and StoryCorps is an attempt by NPR to capture wonderful narratives about relationships in our country. People take their spouses or their kids or their friends, and they talk for an hour about what their relationships look like. I decided that the person I wanted to go and do StoryCorps with was Nolan, who's not my spouse or my child or my relative, and that what I wanted us to talk about was who we really were and where our beliefs came from. And it was something that we hadn't really done before. And at the point at which we did this, we'd known each other about 10 years. But I don't think we'd ever really sat down and said, what makes me a progressive? Why do I believe the things that I believe? And what makes Nolan a conservative? Where does he get these ideas from? And we sat and talked for an hour about those things. Did not talk about any issues, no political issues, didn't have any arguments or debates for once. We just listened to each other. And that was kind of a turning point, I think, in the relationship. I think both of us learned things in that session we didn't know about the other. And I think both of us understood far more about the disagreements we had, where they actually come from, and the opportunity to be able to see commonality on both sides, because we knew more about what the motivation was on the other side, why somebody was taking a position, and that was a real key step in creating the Civility Project. We figured if we could do that, if we could learn that about one another and improve the dialogue between us, improve the arguments between us, by improving the relationship between us and by deepening the understanding on both sides, that was something that was worth sharing with other people. And so for the last couple of years, we've been trying to take that to other people and get them to share that same kind of experience in order to reach the ability to have these kind of civil but passionate dialogues.
And if I can just add here, we're not trying to gloss over differences. There are real differences and there are real reasons for the differences. We're not trying to chase away the anger. There's real reasons to be angry. But what we are trying to do is get rid of the hate, particularly in personal relationships, because too often we make assumptions about people and we fall into this, I hate that person because of their political views, and there's simply just too much hate. And what we want to show is that you can disagree and still respect each other. You can disagree passionately, as Steve and I do, and still love one another. I'd do anything for this man. But I never agree with him. That you can approach someone who holds different points of view than you do and not feel threatened and not feel afraid or what have you. We're trying to just foster civil dialogue and confront this hate that seems to have caught up our nation. And it's a very dangerous thing. And we think we are headed to a very bad place if we don't confront the hate.
So thanks for starting that off, you guys. I really appreciate that. I did put the link to the Civility Project website where you can learn more about Nolan and Stephen in the chat. I also put the link to the StoryCorps video if you guys would like to, or recording if you'd like to check it out. So I think what we're going to do now is we're going to jump into the breakout rooms. And so here's how it's going to go. I'm going to put you guys into a group with 5 or 6 other people, and I will broadcast the question when you're in the group. But basically, we want each person to have a chance to talk about what motivates your political position. So in terms of where you are politically, what is important to you, what motivates your vote or your position. And I hope everyone will have a chance to speak. You'll have 7 minutes, and you will say that that's not enough time, and we'll come back and we'll debrief and discuss. And then we'll go into a second round where we can build on that in the same group. And then we'd love to hear after both sessions how it went, what you noticed, anything that came up. So I am going to put you guys into these breakout rooms, and we will go. So ready? And if you don't know how to get into them, it should come up and put you into a breakout room automatically. It'll also tell you that they're sending you there, and you can click on it and it'll put you there. So good luck. Here we go. Welcome back, everybody. Always feels like time travel when we pop back and forth between these rooms. All right, so let's wait for everybody to come back from their rooms. And here they are. Great. So I always like to ask after we have our first breakout session, if anybody would like to share how the conversation went, or something that you noticed, or something that resonated with you. And if you'd like to just, unmute your microphone and please share what you'd like to with the rest. Anybody want to share what happened in their group? Something that was interesting, something that was surprising?
Sure, yeah, I'll share. So, and I think it's a good sort of microcosm of a bigger group. Like, some people like to follow politics and talk about it, and some really don't. Some want to keep their views to themselves, and some are more passionate about things. And I think you find that that's kind of a small anecdotal thing that you find in a bigger crowd.
Mm-hmm. How did it go in your group? Was there, were people comfortable? Did they feel safe?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you
Definitely.
find similarities or surprising, like that, oh, wow, we're on different sides of the spectrum, but we agree on the same issues or anything?
We were just talking about where we got our political influences from more than actually specific issues. So we didn't really get into that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Our group found we didn't really have time to talk.
Yeah.
One person did all the talking.
I told you you'd want more time, right?
Yeah.
We'll have another round.
To do on a time schedule.
Yes. Yeah. We'll have another group session. So that'll be.
I think that this time schedule gave us time to talk a bit in generalities.
Uh-huh.
And our group didn't have anything that was startling.
Okay.
And we all know each other except one person who was on the phone, and I didn't recognize that person.
Okay.
Couldn't see them.
Uh-huh.
But I don't think that any of us had political views that were startlingly different from one another.
Okay.
And we apologize for the format. I mean, there's limitations to this format. When we do these sessions in person, what we try to do is group people up with others who are different from them, feel different than they do, come from different places, whether it's politically or other identifying factors, and ask them to start with the idea of don't talk about your differences. Try to get to know each other, ask each other questions about the why. why do you feel this way? What in your background, what in your experiences, what in the values you developed over a lifetime make you this way politically or that way politically? And that's the whole point here, is to start with this process of building familiarity and building respect, and building this recognition that all of us come to our opinions the same way. We take the facts, we take the information, we apply our personal experiences, our personal values, and come up with an opinion. And if mine is different than yours, doesn't make one of us evil or stupid or anything else. We're just different. And understanding that first, before you start having the difficult conversations, is the key step of this project in our minds.
Yeah, and that's why the first question we always say, well, what motivates your political position?
Right.
Not what is your politics, but what motivates it? You know, what are the factors behind it? And how did you get there? And a lot of us never think about that. So it's kind of a nice exploration personally, as well as in a group setting.
And it's easy to make assumptions about the why. You know, this person feels this way because they're this, that, or the other. It's not until you start sitting down with each other and talking about the reasons and hearing from the person across the table from you about the why that you develop an understanding and begin that process of getting to the point where you can have a respectful conversation.
With that in mind, would anybody else like to share what happened in their group or something that they noticed before we jump into a second round with a different question? Anyone? All right. Well, so the next round, I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes and you'll still tell me it's not enough.
And then,
But what you, yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
I think Julia Schaeffer wanted to say something.
Okay.
No? No, now she's leaving me off. There she is.
I thought it was interesting that in our group, I think each of the people who spoke used a big noun like justice or compassion or equality or the greater good. So it was pretty lofty conversation, not much about where we've been in life.
Interesting. So then, Julia, do you think that when somebody says they come from a place of compassion or seeking justice, that could inform a lot of different political stances, right?
I'm sure you're right, but I tend to think that those are words that are used by folks who consider themselves progressive or liberal politically.
Interesting.
I
Okay.
need to learn something, apparently.
Nolan, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, no, I mean, and that's, I think, one of the things you have to get beyond if you expect to have productive civil conversations. If you think you're the only one who talks to God, you know, keep in mind that the other person across the table from you thinks that too. And, you know, as Steve and I often say, you know, our differences are not in where we want to end up. We all want to end up, both he and I, all of you want to end in a more just society, a more prosperous nation, a more fair society. It's the path we take to get there where we differ. And once you understand that the goals aren't different, the end goal is usually not different, makes that understanding of why we differ on the process perhaps easier to get to, and begins the steps toward reaching consensus, reaching agreement, reaching compromise.
Stephen and Nolan, before we go into the second breakout session, will you guys take a few minutes to talk about the things in your background that lead you to your positions? And then that's the question we're going to cover in the next breakout room. So maybe just spend a little bit of time explaining to everybody, you know, what in your background and your upbringing led you to where you stand today politically.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll start. I mean, I'm from the rural South. I'm a conservative because I believe that, you know, I believe in the rights and powers of the individual. I believe my rights as an individual come from my creator, not from any government. I believe that I have the right to decide what's best for me and the best way to live my life. And I believe in minimum government interference from that. I think there's a place for government, a big place for government, but it never should be the dominant role in our lives. And so, I think that's, my core conservative values. It comes from my upbringing, as I said, in a rural farm environment where, so we had to be dependent on ourselves, and sort of the mistrust of outsiders that grew up from that.
Nolan, you told a story once in one of our sessions about your parents and sort of illustrating how you learned that from a young age. Do you want to share anything about that just to sort of illustrate what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, my parents were like a lot of folks from their era, Depression, raised during the Depression, and, grew up in poverty and no education, very little education. Neither one of them went past the 8th grade. And, their whole attitude was, it's sink or swim. We've got to work and work hard and take care of ourselves because nobody else to take care of us. And that's what they passed on. They didn't know much about schooling. And, as I said, neither one of them ever attended a high school class, but they instinctively understood that education was a way up for their children. And so they preached that message. I'm sure a lot of parents, particularly a lot of people, preach that to their children, particularly people who have grown up without means. I don't think it's any different whether you're from inner city Detroit or the rural South. If you're, if you're poor, if you're, part of the working class, I think that's a message you instinctively understand.
Thank you. Stephen, would you like to share a little bit about what from your background has
Sure.
informed your stance?
Yeah, I mean, before I start, I would just point out that you'll hear echoes of what Nolan says about where he's from and the kind of values that he learned from his family in the same stories that I would tell about growing up in this country. And that's one of the things that I think is really important about this project, is realizing that even though we really disagree about politics and policy, there is a lot of crossover in terms of where it comes from. We just kind of arrived at different places for different reasons. I always start with the idea that my life and the life that I'm able to live in this country is only made possible by immense struggle over hundreds of years in order to get the bit of equality that we experience in America today. On my mother's side, I come from a very deep union background. My mom's dad was a union organizer in the auto plants in Cincinnati, and caught the eye of Walter Reuther, who was the founder and the executive director, CEO of the UAW, who brought him to Detroit to help organize politically in this city, helped elect the first Black mayor here in the city of Detroit, and became a huge part of both the civil rights and the early movements of Black politics in Detroit. On my father's side, I always tell the same story about my dad. My dad is born in 1933 in Mississippi, and grows up and joins the Air Force during the Korean War, goes off and serves his country like many young people did at that time. And he comes home to a Mississippi where he can't vote, where he can't sit at a lunch counter, where he can't get jobs that he's super qualified for because he was an Air Force mechanic, where he can't go to to college to put the GI Bill to work, like hundreds of thousands of returning veterans are, where he can't buy a house in the neighborhoods where the GI Bill is subsidizing opportunities for veterans. You know, that kind of discrimination, that kind of lack of opportunity shapes his life, and therefore shapes a lot of mine in terms of the idea of trying to get more, trying to be, you know, on equal footing with other Americans. And so the progressive nature of my politics is really framed by that struggle. I think that's true for most African Americans, that not too far in our histories, you don't have to go back. This is not some ancestor I read about in a book. This is my father. This is the first man I knew experienced incredible discrimination until he moved to the North. You know, the idea of fulfilling the American promise of equality and opportunity is at the base of my progressive ideals. And for me, you know, Nolan was talking about government being in the way of those ideals. Sometimes that's true for African Americans. I mean, in the South, Jim Crow was the government, and the government was aiding with discrimination. We wanted the government out of our way in that case. Often, though, in the North, what we see is discrimination in private settings that's not quite like it was in the South, and we need the government to step in and say no. And so it's about sort of a different basis for where you come at the issues that I think really divides us into that sort of conservative and liberal bin.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys. So we'll jump into the breakout rooms for one last session. You'll have 10 minutes. And what I'd love for you to talk about is what things in your background and your values lead you to your political stances. So we'll look forward to coming back in 10 minutes and have a good time.
You're unmuted now. You can talk to her.
Great. So I think we're getting everybody back now. Would anybody like to share something interesting from their group or that they realized?
I realized I'd like to get to know every one of them a little bit better.
That's awesome. Great.
We learned that George lived in a yurt.
Really? How
Was a hippie.
Very cool. Anybody else want to share anything from their group? What have unfolded in the conversation?
Well, this is a little bit off topic, but like the first whole half of our time talking had to do with, I think it was Nolan's response that we all want the same thing. And we're not sure that you know, it's like the feeling was that you had to sort of start by really making sure that you want the same thing. Like you can say lofty goals, but you know, if things were that way, would we really like the way society looked? Like if there was really like everything was representative of the percentage of Latina X people and Black people, you know, would we really like the way that looked? So we weren't sure that everybody would have the same goals. And that seemed to be kind of a key thing when you're developing your relationship, might be after you've got a trust situation, really working to make sure you were really working for similar goals.
It's a really good point, Mary. Stephen or Nolan, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I mean, I think she's right. I mean, but when we talk about goals, I think we're talking a little less specific than, you know, than she's speaking of. I mean, we all want to be better people. We all want stronger communities. we all want a more prosperous, fair country. What that looks like in the end, obviously there's differences there, but we all want to go in a better place and take our communities, our country to a better place. We're going to scrap a little bit about what that looks like perhaps, but I think once you understand that the motivations for most people are good, are good-hearted, makes it easier for us to work together to get to that better place.
Right. So I just want to push back a little bit on that, Nolan, and ask a question. So when you said stronger communities, right?
Mhm.
I think the definition of stronger community might be different depending on who you talk to, right? Depending on your perspective, right? Is a stronger community for you? Is the definition something where there's a lot of police presence and you can't, drop a piece of paper on the sidewalk without, getting caught by the litter guy? Or is your definition of a stronger community where people are looking out for one another and kids feel safe to run in the backyards? And, I think it gets into, as we talk about what are our mutual goals. I mean, you talked about what the mutual goals would be the same and the way we get there is different. And I agree on part of that, but I think you have to define what your definition is of, in this example, stronger community, right? How is that defined? If you're Black, it's one answer. If you're white, it's a different answer. If you're a woman, it's a different answer. If you're gay, it's a different answer. So
yeah, and on the specific of it, perhaps that's true, but I think in general, when I speak about that, Steve and I have been working together for a number of years, trying to make this community better and a better place to live, coming in a community that was pretty devastated for a long time. There are different views of what the better should look like when we finally get there, but there's little disagreement that we need to make progress toward a better, stronger community, a more livable place for everyone, a more just place for everyone. And you can parse out what the specifics of that look like. But I think, that's what I'm speaking of when I talk about, building a better community, building a more prosperous nation, building a better place for our children to live. What better means, is certainly going to be a product of individual interpretation. But the idea that we need to progress, I think, is a shared value.
Lisa, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say the idea that we need change is the value. I think some people, I don't want to get mired in the semantics of everything. I just think you have to, if you're going to move forward, you have to have a definition of what forward is and how far that is, and whether you're talking about 3 feet forward or 700 feet forward. And you have to kind of define the goal so that people are on the same sheet of music, so to speak. So I just think that's where the challenge is. I think you can do it civilly and have good conversation, but I just, because the idea of, like Nolan said, the definition of a better world or a better system, it varies from person to person. So
no, but wherever you end up, everybody's got to be comfortable within that. It can't be better for one and not another. And so
I totally agree with you.
That's the process.
You have to listen to all the voices. Unmute yourself, Josh, and talk.
Oh yes, there we go. I think though, I think we would be remiss though if we didn't acknowledge though that there are that people are going to be starting from different places to begin with, and that I think there is a reality if we're talking about people generally as a nation, and there is the reality that for some people there's not the same intention to want to progress, however you may define that. I'm not I'm not putting a label to that, but people are starting at different places. And the reality is too, right. I think we have to, I find it for me in terms of, I guess where I'm, or from my perspective, I should say, is right that people also, people are different and they are bringing different perspectives. And because they also have different life experiences, right? Like we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge, right, as I think what Stephen mentioned, right, that in terms of for some folks, right, there has been a long struggle that continues to this day, intergenerational, and for others there has not been, and yet for a third group that may be a mixture of in between. So if there's one thing I think it's for me is that we seem to sometimes oversimplify, and I don't think, to Lisa's point, I'm not sure. I think the semantics do matter. I think that by we trying to not acknowledge that there are differences, devalues the fact that people have different perspectives to bring to the table, and that's crucial if we want to talk about moving forward, assuming we have the same agreement of what forward means.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Josh. And I want to steer us a little bit to, since we only have about 20 minutes, one of the things that Stephen and Nolan usually get into in these sessions is, well, what can we all do tangibly to start to build these dialogues and these conversations so that we can get to that sort of foundation of shared beliefs or shared perspectives. And so if you wouldn't mind, I know, Mary, you had a question as well, and I'm going to ask you if you would just put it in the chat so I can get that before Stephen and Nolan. But Stephen and Nolan, I'd love it if you guys might steer the conversation toward, okay, so now what? So we had these conversations. There's so much great input from this group. What can each of us do after tonight to make, to take a step in the right direction? So what would be your first steps for all of us?
Well, I mean, we have certain tips, certain specific things that we believe will help folks who are different and who don't agree with each other, maybe don't trust each other fully, to develop a method of having healthy communication and healthy dialogue. And we mentioned at the beginning, first, build that familiarity with one another, so you can build trust and build respect, understand where the person's coming from. I'll let Steve talk about the importance of listening, because he's much more, he says it much better than I do. And so, listening is the next thing, honest listening. And Steve, why don't you talk about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we talk about kind of core principles of civility in the project, the things that we think have to attend a civil interaction or dialogue. One of them, as Nolan said, is this idea of reaching out to someone in good faith and saying that you understand, you don't agree, but that you want to find a way to be able to talk. Listening is another super important core principle of civility. And when we use that word, we mean something a little different than I think most of us think of when we hear that word. I think most of us think listening means not talking. If I'm not moving my mouth, I'm listening to you. And of course, there's a little more to it than that. Often, if we're not talking, we're still inside our own heads thinking about what we might say when the other person stops talking, or thinking about what the other person is saying in judgmental terms or dismissive terms. When we talk about listening, we really talk about being able to try to really understand what the other person is saying, why they're saying it, where it's coming from, and being able to relate to it, not relate to it in the sense of, well, I agree with that, but relate to it in the sense of, well, I do understand what this person really is saying, and I don't necessarily just kind of brush it off because I disagree with it. I am actually listening to what that person is saying. The other really core principle that we talk about is this idea of sticking to the exchange. And that doesn't mean you have to sit and endlessly talk about something. It doesn't mean you have to talk past the productive point of any conversation. But it does mean when you get up and end the conversation, you kind of commit to coming back. Nolan and I really get after each other sometimes when we're talking about politics or policy. And a lot of times we reach the point where there's not much more to say. There's not much more point in saying more. But each of us always gets up from the conversation and says, I'll be back next time. We'll come back to this conversation. That's pretty key. And it's hard. I mean, these are hard things to do. It's easy to shut people out. It's easy to say, I'm not going to talk to that person anymore. I'm not going to deal with that person anymore. We kind of have to override that instinct that we all have and say, well, this person may make me uncomfortable. The arguments this person's making may make me angry, but I'm going to stay with it because there's a value to the exchange itself. There's a value to being able to have that exchange that I place above the idea of, being comfortable in the conversation or winning the argument or any of these other things.
So, we've had quite a year, and I think it's really important for us to just sort of address the big elephant in the room. So 2020 was like the perfect storm with, political tension, racial turmoil, a horrible public health situation, so many things going on all at the same time. And then, of course, people being isolated and separated. And so, how do we build civility in a time like this? Any one of these things could be, a terrible issue. But then, speak to that. Like, how do we even attempt it, especially when we can't be face to face? Because I know you guys talk a lot about how when you're sitting across from someone, it's such a different dynamic than when you're behind a screen or something. So let's talk about that.
Well, Lynn, I think that's, we can answer that by continuing this conversation, the how-to conversation. And Steve talked about listening. And, I think it's also important to, figure out what value you want to get out of a conversation and an interaction and setting honest goals. Do you truly want to gain understanding? Do you want to perhaps learn something from the person you disagree with or you're having a confrontation with? Or is your goal to convert, to preach? Because, if you're setting out to score a win, to get a win, I really put him or her in her place. I won that argument. It's not a productive conversation. Set an honest goal. I want to learn something. I want to understand something. You're not out there to convert. If my goal was to convert Steve, I would have quit a long time ago. That is never going to happen. And if it did, I'd probably just lay down and say, well, take me now, Lord, because there's no fun in life anymore. There's value in having a conversation, an honest conversation with someone you disagree with, and that I'll just use our personal example. Having those exchanges with Steve helps me check my own arguments, helps me, pause and say, well, am I wrong? Might I be wrong? Weighing his argument against mine. There's value in that. And I don't know that there's any value in me trying to convert him. And I think so. You have to set an honest goal for a conversation. You have to check your self-righteousness at the door. We talked about that earlier. Everybody tends to think they're the only ones who speak to God. And, if you honestly, set aside your own assumptions and your own self-righteousness and approach a conversation, an interaction, an exchange with the idea that I might get something of value here myself. I'm not a missionary here. I'm trying to understand, to learn. Much more productive. If you find yourself asking more questions than lecturing, I think you're on a right path. And it's something you can learn to do.
So how about that 2020 question? Stephen, would you jump in about that and talk a little bit about some of the elements of this year, how that complicates civility building?
No, it really does. You know, there are a lot of things about the issues we're dealing with that make it difficult. There are a lot of things about the way we have to deal with these issues that make it difficult. The pandemic is not conducive to the kinds of interpersonal exchanges that I think a civil conversation kind of requires. You know, I'll say two things about this year. One, it's reminded us of the importance of being able to do this, right? That we have serious issues that divide us, that require us to be able to talk to each other and be able to come up with solutions. You know, a crisis, unfortunately, is not a great time to try to build these kinds of relationships for obvious reasons. And the pandemic is a great example of that. But it highlights the importance of doing so when we aren't in the middle of a pandemic or you know, the most bitter presidential election that any of us can remember, or really, really complex and difficult questions about racism and systemic inequality. It reminds us that when things are quote unquote normal and not like this is when we need to be doing the work to be able to build the relationships that make it possible to have those conversations, even in the middle of these crises. The other thing I would say is, you know, I think we're learning this year, you know, the value of space for ourselves to think about things and not feel, you know, not feel pressured or hurried to have to say something. Space for other people to do the same. The things that we're dealing with right now are so difficult and they ask so much of us, and we're all frightened. We're all under more stress than we have been before. You know, it's okay to say, you know, I can't do this right now. I can't have this conversation. I can't have this argument right now because I need to sort through more of what it means and more of what is going on. I need to understand more about what's going on before I do that. I think giving ourselves and other people the room to do that is really important in this year, especially. I expect it'll be just as important next year. I don't think all these things are just going to, you know, solve themselves instantly when the clock strikes midnight on December 31st. But I think those are important lessons to carry with us into that next year.
So I want to mention something that Mary said, and then I know that Gregory and Ashley wanted to chime in as well. So Mary said, I think the establishing a relationship phase might be helpful in helping us to understand our own blind spots and exploration of ourselves through the eye of another. She also wanted to hear from Stephen if he feels that if you feel that you and Nolan ever make progress toward goals without worrying about the nitty gritty of defining the end game, or does it never get past, at least with one person, to be civil? Like, what is progress? So do you want to answer that quickly, and then we can turn over to Gregory and Ashley?
I guess I'm not sure what the question is. Can you read it again?
Mary, do you want to clarify? Maybe I'm losing something in translation. Mary, are you still here?
I just wanted to know if you always like if your positive thing here is that you and Nolan have learned how to speak with each other civilly, and you're trying to share that with each other, but do you never discuss end games or goals or define what steps go next, or is it always just that it's helped you to be able to appreciate the views of the other
I see.
person, and sometime it may happen?
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of what you're asking there is, do we ever get to the place where we can agree on a solution or a way forward? I don't think we do very often. We genuinely disagree, and neither one of us, I think, is stuck in the idea that we will convince the other that we're right, and that we'll win the argument and move forward in the direction that I want to go. I think that the thing that we're trying to do instead is to be able to really understand what the other side's position looks like. And, that has a couple of values, kind of inherent values. One is, understanding that there is another way to see it, understanding that there's another legitimate way to see most things. It doesn't mean everything, but most issues have many different legitimate sides that other people are perfectly reasonable for believing in. The other inherent value is something that Nolan has already mentioned, which is that your own arguments are better for knowing what the other arguments are. I mean, I think both of us would say that we're really quick to change our own arguments, to change the way we make our own arguments, to change the way we think about our own arguments based on the arguments we hear from the other. If the other one says something that we hadn't considered, if the other one says something that seems to undermine our positions, I think we're both pretty keenly looking out for that. And when it happens, we'll refine our own arguments. I think there's a tremendous value in that. And you can't do that if you're not talking to somebody who you disagree with. I mean, I think the goal here, again, is not necessarily persuasion or winning over. It is understanding, and maybe that has its own limits in terms of its usefulness, but it is useful in the ways I was just talking about.
But we have, there have been incidents where we have worked together on specific projects
Sure.
to on behalf of the community. I think, for example, a few years ago when we stopped the mass roundup of Black kids at the fireworks, very important issue to both of us. Now, we had different reasons, perhaps, for or maybe not. Maybe they were the same, but we were able to work together because of our relationship and stop that. Criminal justice reform is an area we agree on and have both pushed, and we're now seeing some very positive activity in Michigan. And we may come to the issue from different places, but the solutions I think we broadly agree on. So there are incidents where this relationship, and people say, well, if Nolan and Steve agree on this, and if they're working on this, it gives it a little more credibility from both sides. We can bring both political perspectives and both camps together, and we have in a few instances.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Gregory and Ashley, do you want to chime in really quickly? We have one more question that I want to get to.
Sure. That was me. First off, thanks, Stephen and Nolan. This has been really interesting, and a lot of the things you're saying are sort of a music to my ear, because I've actually said a couple of these things myself when talking to people. One thing that hasn't been brought up, which I think is really important, is when you have these debates and conversations, debate the ideas, disagree with the ideas, but do not try to separate the ideas from the individual that's saying them. That's so big in all of these conversations. And unfortunately, there is a sect of people out there right now and we don't have time on this call to get into it, obviously, that really don't want to, they fundamentally believe that we should not separate ideas from people. And that, in my mind, is probably one of the most dangerous things happening in our American political discourse right now. And if there was one thing that everyone on this call, I hope, thinks about afterwards too, is just how do I make sure that I don't do that in my conversations? Because I really think anything like this project is to have success, we really need to do that. And I'm not saying it's easy, it's hard. I think it's even harder over social media and the internet than even, I think it's easier to do face to face, but I just think fundamentally, and I wanted to bring that, I wanted to just bring that out to the crowd. That's what I try to fundamentally do on all of this stuff when I have these conversations and when I have disagreements. Let me attack or disagree with the idea you're presenting and not the person behind it. I just wanted to say that real quick.
That's a great point. Don't assume you hate somebody because of their political views. And, I always tell this story. Steve, one of the first times Steve and I were together was at the Republican State Convention in Michigan many, many years ago. We were both covering it. And he and I were at a bar together late one night after the sessions. We didn't really mention that one of the things we love to do is drink bourbon together. But anyway, we were out there drinking and I walked away. We were at the bar having, great conversation, and walked away. And these two ladies approached me, who I knew, Republican ladies, and said, how can you be friends with him? How can you spend that much time with him? He's awful. We just hate him. And I said, have you met him? No. Have you ever talked to him? No. I said, well, how do you know you hate him? I said, go over and talk to him. Go spend a few minutes with him. 2 hours later, I had to pull Steve away and they walked away and said, oh, he's just great. Now his opinion didn't change, but they took the time to get to know him as something other than what he writes.
Thank you. So we have literally 3 minutes, and one question that came up that is always important in these sessions that we haven't gotten to, maybe we can end with this, is the role of social media and sort of how that is polarizing us in so many ways. I wonder if maybe you guys can wrap us up with a little bit of mention about that too.
I use it as little as possible, but it's the seventh circle of hell in my mind. It has been the biggest enabler of incivility and the bane of my existence. Every time I write something, sign on the computer and see the most vile post on social media. It's just, I see little use in it or little good in it, but.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly we have a cultural problem with social media in this country, or a couple of them. One of them is something we already talked about, which is this idea of shutting people out and pushing people away. Social media really encourages that. There's this bravado about I blocked this person and I don't have to deal with them anymore. I'm not going to talk to them anymore. And then bragging about that with other people on social media, which is kind of a reinforcing dynamic that again leads to incredible incivility. Now, I am more hopeful about social media than Nolan is. I think it's a very young medium that is in a very early state, not proving its value, but most technological advances in communication had the same problems when they were young, and we figured it out. We figured out how to use it a little more intelligently, and we couldn't do without most of them. And I think social media will get to that point. But for now, I think there's an imperative for people to resist those really negative cultural impulses that social media encourages. I mean, this idea of walking away from people and shutting people out is really dangerous. It's the opposite of civility. It's the opposite of what we're talking about. And so you have to resist that dynamic from social media just to be able to participate in something that we're defining as civil.
It also fosters this echo chamber environment where all of our circles, all of our social circles, everybody we talk to are people who think just and believe just like we do. There was a poll before the last election, Cato did it. Half of Americans didn't know somebody who was going to vote differently than they did. Not healthy.
Yeah.
Well, I cannot believe how quickly an hour and a half went. You guys are amazing. This has been a really different session and it's been great. I hope you've all enjoyed it. If you want to stay in touch, we do a monthly newsletter with information about how to continue building civility, tips, articles, opportunities to do more sessions with us. We are really booked already January, February. We're starting to book up in March. If you know of an organization or company or community that you think this would benefit, do let me know. I'll put my email in the chat and you can reach out at any time. And we do 30, 60, and 90-minute sessions. So it doesn't always have to be this format. It can be a shorter thing too. I thank you all for being here. Really grateful and hope that we will see you again. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Yeah.
Thanks, Frederick.
Thank you very
Maryland, for
much.
having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rain.